"Who hurt you?" the Alpha King whispered. His voice was not a roar. It was the terrible low hum of a collapsing mountain. In the gilded, candlelit gallery of the Château de Valois, the music died instantly. The court froze, wine-glass stems snapping in the sudden, suffocating pressure of his aura. Serafina pressed her hand against her torn silk sleeve, her fingers trembling but her chin held high. The blood was a vivid, shocking red against her silver-woven French gown. Alaric stepped closer, the shadow of his massive, ancient frame swallowing her whole. His golden eyes, primeval and merciless, locked onto the faint, bruised handprints marring her pale wrists. "Tell me, Serafina," he murmured, his touch surprisingly feather-light as he traced the edge of the ruined silk. "And by morning, half the pack will be dead. The goal of this opening is to establish immediate, high-stakes conflict. By contrasting the refined elegance of a French-style court with the raw, primal threat of the Alpha, we set up a unique atmospheric tension. Alaric's quietness is designed to be far more terrifying than overt anger, signaling his absolute power. The air in the grand hall of Valois always smelled of roasted stag, old stone, and the faint bitter tang of pine needle incense, an attempt by the court-dwelling nobility to mask the musk of their true natures. Tonight, however, the air smelled only of fear. Serafina stood beneath the towering stained-glass window depicting the long-ago treaty between humanity and the ancient wolf lords. She was a creature of silk, etiquette, and quiet observation. Unlike the court of Alaric, she possessed no claws, no heightened senses, and no protective instincts of a pack. She had only her wits, polished to a razor's edge in the ruthless courts of the southern provinces. Across the long trestled tables laden with silver chargers and half-eaten game, the lords of the northern marches watched her. They were large, broad-shouldered men dressed in heavy velvet doublet coats that strained against their powerful frames. Their eyes, varying shades of amber and predatory gray, tracked her every movement. To them, she was an interloper, a fragile human plaything who had somehow captured the attention of their ancient sovereign. "She wears our colors, yet she bleeds like a lamb," muttered Lord Gauthier, his voice carrying easily over the muted chatter of the lower tables. He was a brute of a man, his fingers thick with heavy signet rings, his collar unbuttoned to reveal a thick throat scarred by old challenge matches. Serafina did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the empty high throne of dark carved oak. To show weakness here was to invite the pack to hunt. She smoothed the front of her gown, her fingers brushing the stiff embroidery of her bodice, deliberately concealing the dark purple bruises that ringed her wrists beneath her long lace cuffs. The heavy iron-shod doors at the back of the hall groaned open. A silence fell over the room, heavy and absolute, like the dropping of a guillotine. The lords stood, their chairs scraping against the stone floor in a discordant chorus of submission. Alaric entered alone. He did not wear the crown of gold and rubies. He had no need for such trinkets. He wore a simple midnight black tunic of heavy wool, bordered with subtle silver thread, and a dark mantle pinned with a silver wolf's head. He was ancient, not in the frailty of years, but in the sheer weight of his presence. His hair was the color of winter earth, flecked with silver at the temples, and his face was carved from hard, unyielding angles. When his golden eyes swept the room, even the most arrogant of the young lords bowed their heads, their throat-exposing gestures instinctive. Alaric did not walk to his throne. His gaze locked onto Serafina, standing pale and isolated against the vibrant glass of the window. The silence deepened, stretching until the crackle of the hearth fire sounded like dry bones snapping. He walked toward her, his strides long and soundless. The court parted before him like water before a prow. As he approached, his nostrils flared, catching the scent of iron in the air, her blood. Serafina felt the temperature in the room drop. The ancient magic of the Alpha King was not a physical weapon, but it felt like a cold blade pressed against the back of her neck. She curtsied, a perfect, elegant movement she had practiced since childhood. But before she could rise, Alaric reached out. His large calloused hand closed gently around her forearm. He did not pull, but the command in his touch was absolute. With agonizing slowness, he drew back her lace cuff, exposing the weeping scratches and the dark, ugly bruises that marred her skin. The collective breath of the room hitched. Who did this? Alaric's voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Seraphina looked into his eyes, searching the depths of those golden pools. She saw the ancient beast stirring beneath the civilized veneer of the king. She knew what would happen if she spoke a name. The blood spilled tonight would drown the palace, and the fragile piece she had spent months weaving would burn to ash. "It was an accident, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. A misstep in the gardens. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the lords, but Alaric's expression did not soften. His thumb brushed the edge of her bruise, and she shivered at the contrast between his rough skin and her tender flesh. "A misstep," Alaric repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "In the gardens of Valois, where every stone belongs to me, where every wolf answers to my call." He let go of her arm, but his gaze did not waver from her face. He turned slowly, looking back at the assembly of his court. The lords stood frozen, some with their hands resting unconsciously near the hilt of their ceremonial daggers, others refusing to meet their king's eyes. "We shall see," Alaric murmured. "We shall see what the morning brings." The private solar of the king was a stark contrast to the opulence of the great hall. Here, the walls were bare stone, hung only with heavy dark tapestries to keep out the drafts. A massive map of the kingdom lay stretched across a long oak table, weighted down by iron daggers and pieces of unpolished amber. Seraphina sat on a low velvet bench near the hearth, a small silver bowl of warm water and a linen cloth resting beside her. She was trying to clean the dried blood from her wrists, but her hands were shaking too badly to be effective. "Let me," she jumped. She hadn't heard Alaric enter. The heavy oak door had opened and closed without a sound. Alaric knelt before her. The sight of the ancient Alpha King, a man who ruled 3 kingdoms with an iron fist, kneeling on the cold stone before a human girl would have scandalized the court. He took the linen cloth from her trembling fingers and dipped it into the warm water. "You lie poorly, Seraphina," he said, his voice low and raspy. He began to dab at her wrist with surprising gentleness. "A misstep does not leave the imprint of 5 fingers. To tell you the truth would be to light a fuse, Alaric," she replied, using his name without his title for the first time. It was a dangerous intimacy, but in this quiet room, the titles felt like useless armor. The northern lords are already whispering of rebellion. They think you have grown soft because you tolerate a human at your court. If you slaughter one of them for a bruised wrist, you give them the war they want. Alaric paused, the wet cloth resting against her skin. He looked up, his golden eyes burning with a dark, ancient fire. "They think I have grown soft because I have chosen peace. They forget why they bowed to me in the first place." "They forget because they are young and foolish," Seraphina said, leaning forward, her intelligent eyes searching his. "Gauthier and his faction want a reaction. They want you to act like a beast so they can justify uniting the Pax against you. You must be a king, Alaric, not a monster." "And if being a monster is what keeps you safe?" he whispered. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. Seraphina felt her breath catch. There was a dark, magnetic pull to him, an ancient strength that promised absolute safety in a world that had always been hostile to her. She remembered her father's house, burning in the night. She remembered the cold laughter of the mercenaries who had torn her family apart, and how she had survived by learning to read the shifting winds of courtly malice. She had vowed never to depend on the strength of others, yet Alaric's presence made that vow feel incredibly fragile. "I can protect myself," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Alaric stood, turning his back to her. He walked to the window, looking out over the dark expanse of the forest that surrounded the castle. The moon was a sharp silver crescent, casting long skeletal shadows across the canopy. "You cannot," Alaric said flatly. "You do not understand the nature of the pack, Seraphina. To them, weakness is a disease that must be purged. If they see that they can touch you without consequence, they will not stop at bruises. Tomorrow, it will be your throat." He turned back to her, his face half shadowed by the firelight. "I have given them 5 centuries of peace. I have built their cities, codified their laws, and protected their borders. But if they mistake my patience for weakness—" He trailed off, his hand resting on the hilt of his ancient sword. "Who was it?" he asked again, his voice dropping to a register that made the very stones of the tower vibrate. "Give me the name." Seraphina stood, walking over to him. She placed her uninjured hand on his arm, feeling the rock-hard muscle beneath the wool. "No, if I give you a name, I lose my leverage. Let me handle this in the solar, where the tongue is sharper than the sword." Alaric looked down at her hand on his arm, his eyes narrowing. For a long moment, he did not speak. The tension between them was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. "You have until midnight," he said finally. "If the guilty party has not confessed and offered their head to me by the time the moon reaches its zenith, I will find them myself, and I will not be gentle." The grand gallery was a long, draft-swept corridor lined with the portraits of past kings and the stuffed heads of legendary beasts. Seraphina walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick runners of French tapestry. The castle was quiet, but it was the silence of a predator waiting in the brush. She had 3 hours before midnight. "My lady," a voice purred from the shadows of a recessed archway. Seraphina did not flinch, though her heart leaped into her throat. She stopped, turning slowly to face the speaker. Lord Bertrand stepped into the moonlight. He was younger than Gauthier, with sharp, fox-like features and a deceptively pleasant smile. He was dressed in a doublet of dark green velvet, a heavy silver chain of office looping across his chest. He was the diplomat of the northern faction, a wolf who preferred poison to claws. "Lord Bertrand," Seraphina said, her voice cool and perfectly poised. "You are far from your quarters. The night air in the gallery is famously unkind to those who do not belong here." Bertrand chuckled, a soft, dry sound. "I could say the same for you, my lady, a fragile southern bird in a forest of wolves. It is a miracle you haven't been torn apart yet." He stepped closer, his golden eyes glinting in the dark. He looked down at her bandaged wrists, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Though it seems someone has already begun to pluck your feathers." Seraphina kept her gaze steady, her mind racing. Bertrand was too clever to have done the deed himself. He was a coordinator of whispers, not a brute. But he knew who had done it. "A minor accident, my lord," Seraphina said. "Though I appreciate your concern. I assure you the king's physicians are highly skilled." "The king's physicians can heal physical wounds, yes," Bertrand murmured, leaning against a stone pillar. "But they cannot heal a crumbling throne. Alaric is old, Seraphina. His blood is thick and slow. He clings to the past, to treaties signed with dead men. The world is changing. The packs need a leader who remembers what it is to hunt." "And you think Gauthier is that leader?" Seraphina asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She needed to draw him out, to find the crack in their alliance. Bertrand's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Gauthier is ambitious, and he has the backing of the northern lords. If Alaric continues to favor a human over his own blood, there will be those who demand a challenge. A true alpha does not let his court be ruled by the whispers of a foreign girl. A true alpha does not need to hide in the shadows of a gallery to make his threats, Bertrand," Seraphina replied, stepping closer to him. She could smell the scent of sour wine on his breath, underlaid with the cold smell of iron. She looked him dead in the eye. "Tell Gauthier that if he wishes to challenge the king, he should do so in the light of day. But tell him also that Alaric's blade is very long and very sharp, and it has tasted the blood of far greater wolves than him." Bertrand's eyes darkened, the polite veneer slipping to reveal the snarling beast beneath. He reached out, his hand flying toward her throat, but he stopped himself a mere inch from her skin. his claws trembling with suppressed rage. "You play a dangerous game, human," he hissed. "You think you are safe because the king sleeps in your bed, but even kings must eventually sleep. And when he does, we will be waiting." He turned and vanished into the shadows of the gallery, leaving Serafina alone in the cold moonlight. She looked up at the high-arched windows. The moon was climbing, nearing its peak. She had no name, no confession, and the storm was about to break. The hourglass on Serafina's vanity table was a fragile thing of blown glass and fine, black volcanic sand. She watched the dark grains slip through the narrow neck, each one a second stolen from the fragile peace of the realm. Outside, the wind howled through the stone battlements of the Château de Valois, carrying the scent of incoming snow and the distant, hunting cries of wild beasts. She had less than an hour. Her wrists throbbed beneath the linen bandages Alaric had so gently wrapped. The pain was nothing compared to the cold dread settling deep in her chest. She knew the northern lords. They were creatures of blood and hierarchy, understanding only the language of the Fang. If Alaric acted on his promise, the halls of the chateau would run red before the sun cleared the eastern peaks. She had to find the perpetrator herself, not to save them, but to deny the rebellion the martyr they so desperately craved. Serafina closed her eyes, forcing her mind to become as cold and analytical as a chessboard. Who had the motive? Gauthier was a brute, but he was also a veteran of a dozen pack wars. He knew that a direct assault on the king's favored companion was a death sentence unless it was calculated to achieve a specific end. Bertrand was the tongue, Gauthier the muscle. But there was a third player, someone who had remained in the shadows. A memory flared, a fragment of the assault in the darkened gallery hours ago. The grip on her wrists had been iron tight, but it had not been the rough, calloused hands of Gauthier, nor the scented soft fingers of Bertrand. The skin had been cold, smelling faintly of heavy iron and lavender water, the signature scent of the king's own personal guard. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The traitor was not among the rebellious northern guests. The traitor was inside the household. Serafina stood up, her silk gown rustling in the quiet room. She grabbed a small bronze oil lamp, its flame flickering wildly as she opened her heavy chamber door. The corridors of the residential wing were quiet, almost unnaturally so. The servants had long since retreated to their quarters, sensing the atmospheric pressure of Alaric's brewing wrath. She made her way toward the guard barracks in the lower keep. To reach it, she had to cross the ancient portrait gallery where Bertrand had confronted her. As she entered the long hall, her lamp cast long, grotesque shadows of dead kings against the stone walls. "Looking for a confession, Lady Serafina?" She spun around, raising the lamp. From the shadows of a massive tapestry depicting the founding of the pack, a figure emerged. It was Captain Celine, the commander of Alaric's royal guard. She was a tall, imposing woman with iron-gray hair cropped close to her skull and eyes the color of a winter sky. Celine's hand rested easily on the pommel of her silver-hilted broadsword. "Celine," Serafina said, keeping her voice level despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "You are far from the King's Solar. I thought you were tasked with his personal security tonight." "The king has no need of guards tonight, my lady," Celine said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "When the Alpha King hunts, the guard's only duty is to stay out of his path and to clean up the remains when he is finished." Serafina's eyes dropped to Celine's wrists. Underneath the heavy iron vambraces of her armor, she caught a glimpse of a dark blue sleeve, and a faint scent of lavender water drifted on the drafts of the corridor. "It was you," Serafina whispered. Celine did not deny it. She stepped forward, her heavy boots clicking rhythmically on the stone floor. "Gauthier is a loudmouth, and Bertrand is a coward. They would talk of rebellion for another decade without ever drawing a blade. The pack is stagnant, Serafina. Alaric has bound us to laws written for humans. He has made us sheep." "So you bruised my wrists to force Alaric to slaughter his own lords?" Serafina's voice was laced with disbelief. "You risked a civil war just to provoke him?" "I did not risk a war. I initiated one. Selene said, her expression hardening into a mask of fanatical devotion. The king must be forced to remember his true nature. If he slaughters half the court tonight, the Pax will finally see him for the monster he is, and they will rise. Or he will refuse to act, proving his weakness, and Gauthier will take the throne. Either way, the era of human treaties ends. The Hightower bell began to toll. 1, 2, 3. The midnight hour had arrived. The heavy, resonant iron tones of the great bell vibrated through the very stones of the Château de Valois. With every strike, Seraphina felt the air grow heavier, the ambient temperature dropping as Alaric's ancient magic began to manifest. It was a physical pressure, a suffocating weight that made her chest tighten. 7, 8, 9, Selene smiled, a cold, humorless curve of her lips. Hear that, human? That is the sound of your world burning. The king's wrath is a beast that cannot be bargained with. Once unleashed, it does not stop until it is sated. You underestimate him, Selene, Seraphina said, taking a slow step backward, her mind scanning the gallery for any avenue of escape. Alaric is not a mindless animal. He will see through this. He won't, Selene replied, drawing her broadsword with a soft, lethal hiss of steel against leather. Because by the time he reaches the Great Hall, Gauthier's champion will already be dead, and the blame will rest entirely on the king's shoulders. And as for you, you won't be alive to tell him otherwise. 10, 11, 12. As the final vibration of the 12th stroke faded into the frozen night, the oil lamp in Seraphina's hand went out. The gallery was plunged into near total darkness, illuminated only by the pale, silver shafts of moonlight piercing the high arched windows. In the gloom, Selene's eyes flared with a predatory, golden light. Seraphina didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy bronze lamp directly at Selene's face and bolted in the opposite direction. Behind her, she heard the heavy metallic clang of the lamp striking armor, followed by an angry snarl. The sound of Selene's heavy, armored footsteps echoed through the corridor, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Wolves were faster, stronger, and built for the hunt. Seraphina had only her knowledge of the chateau's labyrinthine layout. She turned a sharp corner, her silk skirts bunching in her hands as she sprinted toward the servants' spiral staircase. It was narrow, steep, and dark, an environment where a larger, armored opponent would be at a distinct disadvantage. She flung herself into the stairwell, her hand grasping the cold iron central rail as she flew down the stone steps. Behind her, Selene burst into the doorway, her sword scraping against the narrow stone walls with a shower of sparks. "Run all you want, little bird!" Selene's voice echoed down the stairwell, distorted by the stone. "You are in our world now." Seraphina reached the landing of the second floor, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She didn't go toward her chambers. She ran toward the Great Hall. If she could reach Alaric before he began his purge, she could stop the trap from springing. But as she burst through the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery overlooking the Great Hall, she froze. The scene below was bathed in the flickering, orange glow of the hearth fire. The hall was no longer empty. The northern lords were gathered in a tense, silent circle near the high throne. In the center of the circle lay a body. Seraphina's stomach plummeted. It was Lord Gauthier's champion, the young, hot-headed wolf who had muttered insults at her earlier that evening. He lay flat on his back, his throat torn open with brutal, savage precision. The blood was still pooling on the ancient flagstones, reflecting the firelight like a dark, glossy mirror. Standing over the corpse, his hands dripping with fresh crimson blood, was Alaric. His midnight black tunic was stained, and his golden eyes glowed with a terrifying, primal intensity that transcended humanity. The aura radiating from him was so immense that several of the younger lords had been forced to their knees, their bodies trembling under the sheer pressure of his command. "The king has spoken," Bertrand's voice rang out through the hall, filled with a sickening blend of fear and triumph. "He slaughters our young men in the dark. He has broken the treaty. I did not kill him," Alaric said. His voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried the weight of a collapsing star. "But whoever did has signed the death warrant of every traitor in this room." From her vantage point on the upper gallery, Seraphina clutched the wooden balustrade so hard, her knuckles turned white. She had to act. If she remained silent, the Northern Lords would draw their weapons, and Alaric's ancient instincts would drive him to slaughter them all in self-defense, playing right into Celine's hands. "Stop!" Her voice, though human and strained, cut through the suffocating tension of the hall. Every eye flew upward. Alaric's head snapped toward her, his golden eyes narrowing as he took in her disheveled state, her torn sleeve, and the pale terror on her face. The primal, dark cloud of his aura flickered, softening for a fraction of a second at the sight of her. "Seraphina," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Go back to your chambers. This is no place for you." "No, Alaric." She ran down the grand stone staircase, her silver-woven gown dragging behind her. She did not look at the blood on the floor, nor at the snarling lords who glared at her with naked hatred. She stopped a mere 3 paces from Alaric, ignoring the ancient instinct that screamed at her to flee from his overwhelming presence. "It wasn't you, and it wasn't the Northern Lords," she said, her voice steadying as she addressed the entire room. "This is a trap. The killer is Captain Celine." A collective murmur rippled through the hall. Bertrand stepped forward, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "Absurd! Celine is the commander of the Royal Guard. She is the king's most loyal hound. This is a human distraction to save her own skin." "Celine is the one who bruised my wrists," Seraphina countered, turning to face Bertrand directly. She held up her bandaged arms. "She did it to provoke Alaric into a rage, knowing he would demand blood at midnight. She killed Gauthier's champion to ensure that when midnight struck, there would be a body to trigger a war." "And where is the captain now?" Lord Gauthier demanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his massive battle-axe. "If she is the traitor, let her stand before us." "She is in the portrait gallery," Seraphina said, turning back to Alaric. "She tried to kill me to keep the secret. Alaric, you must believe me. If you strike down these lords tonight, you give her exactly what she wants." Alaric looked down at his blood-stained hands, then at the body of the young champion. The silence in the hall stretched, so heavy that the sound of the burning wood in the hearth seemed to deafen. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from the back of the hall. The heavy iron-shod doors were flung open, and Captain Celine marched in, flanked by a dozen heavily armed members of the Royal Guard. Their swords were drawn, and their faces were set in grim, unyielding masks. "Do not listen to her," Celine shouted, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a military commander. "The human has poisoned the king's mind. Look at him. He stands over the body of our brother, his hands covered in his blood. Yet he does nothing but listen to the whispers of a foreign girl. He has grown weak. He is no longer fit to lead the pack." Several of the Northern Lords muttered in agreement, their bodies shifting into predatory stances. The air in the room grew hot with the collective aggression of dozens of wolves on the verge of frenzy. Alaric did not flinch. He slowly wiped the blood from his fingers onto a white linen cloth offered by a trembling page. His expression was completely blank, a terrifying void of emotion that was far more menacing than any snarl. "Celine," Alaric said, his voice dropping to that terrible low hum that made the floorboards vibrate. "You have served me for 3 centuries. You have led my vanguard, defended my borders, and eaten at my table." He stepped over the body of the champion, walking slowly toward her. The guards flanking Celine shifted uneasily, their loyalty to their commander warring with their primal, biological urge to submit to the Alpha King. "I gave you honor," Alaric continued, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "I gave you a purpose, and you brought treachery into my house." "I brought truth," Celine hissed, raising her sword. "If you are still the Alpha King, prove it. Kill me, kill Gauthier, kill us all, or yield the throne to someone who still has the courage to hunt." Alaric stopped 5 feet from her. He did not draw his sword. He simply stood there, a massive dark silhouette against the firelight. "You want a monster, Celine," Alaric whispered. "The Northern Lords want a beast they can fear and hate. You have forgotten why I chose peace. I did not choose it because I am weak. He reached out, his hand moving with a speed that defied human sight. Before Celine could swing her broadsword, Alaric's hand closed around her throat. He lifted her off her feet with a single, effortless motion, her heavy iron armor clattering against his arm. Her sword fell from her grasp, clanging loudly onto the stone floor. The room gasped, the sheer, raw power of the display freezing every wolf in their tracks. "I chose peace," Alaric said, his voice echoing like thunder through the hall. "Because when I hunt, nothing survives." "Who hurt you?" the Alpha King whispered. By morning, half the pack was dead. The air in the great hall of the Chateau de Valois had turned to absolute ice. Captain Celine hung suspended in the air, her face darkening under the tightening, iron grip of the Alpha King. Her boots kicked uselessly against Alaric's knees, her fingers clawing at his wrists in a desperate primal struggle for breath. Around them, the 12 guards she had brought in stood frozen, their weapons half raised, paralyzed by the sheer pressure of Alaric's commanding aura. It was a silent, suffocating wave of biological dominance that demanded absolute submission. "My lord," Bertrand stammered, taking a trembling step backward, his previous bravado evaporating like mist. This is madness. We must have a trial. The laws of the Great Charter." "The Charter is for those who respect the crown," Alaric interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that rattled the crystal chandeliers overhead. He did not look at Bertrand. His golden eyes remained locked on Celine's fading gaze. Treachery is answered by the fang. Serafina moved quickly, stepping into the space between Alaric and the rebellious northern lords. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her posture elegant, her shoulders back, her voice carrying the cold clarity of a court magistrate. "Alaric, stop!" she commanded. It was a human voice, yet it held a strange, undeniable authority that made several of the older wolves look at her in astonishment. No one spoke to the Alpha King in such a manner, let alone a human woman. "If you kill her now, you silence the only voice that can untangle this conspiracy. Look at her guards. Look at the lords. They are not all traitors. Many are merely blind." Alaric's gaze slowly shifted from Celine to Serafina. For a terrifying second, she saw nothing of the man she knew in those golden depths, only the ancient, hungry predator that had ruled the dark forests for centuries. But as his eyes traced the linen bandages wrapping her wrists, a muscle twitched in his jaw. With a brutal flick of his wrist, Alaric threw Celine across the stone floor. She crashed into the heavy oak table, scattering pewter cups and silver platters before collapsing into a coughing heap. "Speak, Celine," Serafina said, stepping toward the gasping captain. "Who else signed your pact? You could not have coordinated Gauthier's champion's death, bypassed the castle security, and poisoned the guard without accomplices inside this very room." Celine spat blood onto the polished flagstones, looking up with a defiant, chilling laugh. "You think I am the only one who wishes to see the old ways return, human? Look around you. Half the men in this room have grown tired of your treaties, tired of hiding behind stone walls and pretending to be civilized. We are wolves," she glared at Alaric. "You have starved our beasts, Alaric. You gave us a crown, but you took away our teeth." Gauthier stepped forward, his massive battle axe lowering slightly. His gaze shifted from the dead body of his young champion to Celine, and then to Alaric. The brute force of his anger was beginning to be replaced by the cold, calculating intelligence of a seasoned warlord. "Celine, did you murder my champion? Did you slaughter my blood just to force my hand?" "He was a fool, Gauthier," Celine hissed, coughing as she tried to stand. "A hot-headed pup who would have died in some useless skirmish anyway. His death was supposed to buy us our freedom." "You betrayed the pack," Gauthier growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. He turned to face Alaric, dropping his axe to the floor with a heavy, resonant clang. "King Alaric, I am a stubborn man, and I do not love your treaties, but I am no traitor. I did not know of this woman's plot. The North does not stand with murderers of our own kin." A heavy sigh of relief seemed to pass through the hall, but the tension was far from broken. Alaric stood in the center of the room, his hands still stained with the champion's blood, his expression unreadable. "The northern lords will remain in the east wing under armed guard," Alaric decreed, his voice brooking no argument. "Captain Selene will be taken to the deepest cells beneath the keep. By morning, I will have every name on her list." He looked at the royal guards who had entered with Selene. "Drop your weapons, now." One by one, the heavy iron swords clattered to the stone floor. The dungeon of the Château de Valois was a place where the dampness of the earth clung to the skin like a second shroud. Serafina held the bronze lamp high, its warm light cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness of the subterranean corridor. Behind her, Alaric moved like a shadow, his footsteps making absolutely no sound on the wet stone. They stopped outside the iron-barred cell where Selene was chained to the wall. The captain's head was bowed, her gray hair matted with sweat and dirt, her breathing shallow but steady. "She won't talk," Serafina whispered, looking up at Alaric. "Her devotion isn't to a person or a throne, it's to an idea. You cannot torture an ideology out of someone." Alaric did not answer immediately. He stepped closer to Serafina, his proximity radiating a comforting, solid warmth in the freezing chill of the underground vaults. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently taking her wrist. He slowly unwrapped the linen bandages, exposing the dark purplish bruises left by Selene's iron grip. He touched the swollen skin with a pat of his thumb, his touch so light it was almost a whisper. "Who hurt you?" the Alpha King whispered, his voice dangerously soft, carrying a quiet, terrifying promise of violence. "By morning, half the pack will be dead if I do not have the names of every hand that touched you." Serafina felt a shiver run down her spine. The question was not born of madness, but of a fierce, possessive love that transcended human understanding. Alaric's wrath was a force of nature, and she was the only thing standing between that force and the utter destruction of the court. "Selene did this," Serafina said softly, her blue eyes meeting his glowing golden gaze. "But she did not act alone. She had help from the guards on duty, the ones who allowed her to enter the residential wing. And Bertrand knew. I saw it in his eyes when Selene marched into the great hall. He wasn't surprised. He was waiting." Alaric's eyes darkened, the gold shifting to a deep, burnt amber. "Bertrand is a parasite. He feeds on the ambition of stronger beasts. I will purge his house by sunrise." "No, Alaric," Serafina urged, placing her hand over his chest, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his heart. "If you slaughter everyone who whispered of rebellion, you will rule over a graveyard. You must be precise. Eliminate the leaders, the active conspirators, but spare the ones who were merely led astray. Show them that the Alpha King is just, not merely monstrous." Selene laughed from the darkness of her cell, the sound wet and rattling. "Listen to the human, pleading for the sheep." "You have already lost, Alaric. Even if you kill me, the seed is planted. The young wolves know what you are. They know you would burn this entire kingdom for a single human girl." Alaric turned his head slowly towards Selene. "You are right about one thing, Captain," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet whisper. "I would burn the world for her, and I will start with your conspirators." He turned back to Serafina, his expression softening just enough for her to see the man behind the crown. "Return to your chambers, Serafina. Lock the door. Do not look out the windows until the sun rises." "Alaric, go," he commanded gently, but with an absolute authority that she knew she could not fight. "Let me do what must be done to keep you safe." Serafina did not sleep. She sat by the tall arched window of her bedchamber, watching the snow fall in silent, heavy flakes over the Château de Valois. The night was unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of wind and nocturnal beasts. But every now and then, the silence was shattered by a distant, choked scream, or the wet, heavy sound of a body hitting the flagstones in the courtyard below. Alaric was hunting. He moved through the castle like a plague, executing his judgment with terrifying, silent efficiency. There were no trials, no long speeches, and no warnings. Those guards who had sworn a secret blood oath to Selene were found in their barracks, their throats torn open. Bertrand was dragged from his chambers in his nightshirt, his cries for mercy cut short in the freezing snow of the outer courtyard. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the eastern clouds, the snow had covered the worst of the carnage, painting the dark courtyard in a pristine, deceptive white. Serafina unlocked her door and walked down the silent, cold corridors. The servants were gone, hiding in their quarters, terrified to breathe. The air smelled faintly of copper and iron, the unmistakable scent of a fresh purge. She walked out onto the high stone balcony overlooking the main courtyard. Alaric stood there, his long black coat dusted with fresh snow, looking out over his silent kingdom. He looked incredibly tired, his shoulders slightly bowed under the weight of the crown he had defended with so much blood. The golden glow in his eyes had faded, returning to their usual deep hazel. "Is it over?" she asked quietly, stepping up to the balustrade beside him. Alaric turned to look at her. The snow fell on his dark hair, melting instantly against his skin. By morning, half the pack was dead, he murmured, his voice hollow. The conspirators are gone. The northern lords have renewed their oaths of loyalty. There will be peace, Serafina. For a time. At what cost? She asked, looking down at the courtyard where the snow was already turning pink in the morning light. The cost of keeping you alive, Alaric said. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, his skin warm against the winter draft. They needed to remember why they fear the night. They needed to know that the treaty is not a shield for traitors. Serafina closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. She knew the court would whisper about this night for generations. They would call Alaric a tyrant, a monster who slaughtered his own people to satisfy his wrath. But she also knew the truth. He had taken the burden of the monster so that she, and the peace they had built together, could survive in the light. "We will rebuild," she whispered, opening her eyes to look at the rising sun. Together. Alaric smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that chased away the shadows of the night. Together, little bird. The conclusion of the narrative arc highlights the tragic necessity of Alaric's actions in a medieval, pack-oriented fantasy setting. By morning, the physical threat is neutralized, but the emotional and political landscape of the Château de Valois has been permanently altered. The ending leaves the readers with a sense of bittersweet resolution. The peace is secured, but the cost was devastatingly high. Thank you so much for reading this dark, dramatic tale of loyalty, betrayal, and primal wrath in the Château de Valois. The intricate dance between Alaric's ancient, terrifying power and Serafina's elegant, human intellect is at the very heart of this story, showing that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the sharpness of one's claws, but in the clarity of one's mind. If you enjoyed this high-stakes medieval drama, filled with suspense, emotional tension, and gothic romance, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more immersive stories. Your support helps bring these dark, enchanting worlds to life.